Thank you to Pam and Ann for hosting the event on Zoom for us. Welcome everyone to the first 2021 meeting of the Wild Ones Kalamazoo. And I want to thank Audubon Society of Kalamazoo for allowing us to join them in today's meeting. Just wanted to say at the end of the program, please go onto the Wild One Kalamazoo website and look at the other events. Ruth has been wonderful in terms of putting together a great program for 2021. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please reach out to anyone on the website that you may see there, whether it's Ann, myself, Ruth, or any of the other members and officers. I wish to turn it over to Audubon Society of Kalamazoo. I believe it's Nate, who is our co-host. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm unmuted now. So welcome to the meeting to Ask Members. We're starting off 2021 kind of like we ended 2020. So right now we're bringing you these virtual presentations, which I'm hoping everybody will enjoy. And I'd like to thank everybody who helped out to put this on. So enjoy the presentation.
It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Ann Frazier, Professor of Biology at Kalamazoo College, and two of her students, Nickson and Nicki Bailey. Ann's interest in pollinators grew out of an insect course she teaches, where student collections revealed what a great variety of bees can be found in the Kalamazoo area. From there, she began her own research into local bees and, for the past 10 years, has been engaging students in research projects aimed at cataloging bee diversity and abundance in the local area, documenting plant-bee interactions, and conducting pollinator conservation outreach in the community. Nickson is a senior undergraduate at Kalamazoo College pursuing a major in biology with a focus in environmental health. Niko has worked with Dr. Fraser for the last 2 years to develop and launch a citizen science program focused on bumblebees in Southwest Michigan. He has enjoyed working with the Southwest Michigan community and looks forward to continued engagement while pursuing an MD at Western Michigan University's medical school beginning in July. Nicki Bailey is a senior undergraduate at Kalamazoo College pursuing a major in biology with a focus in environmental studies. For the past 2 summers, she has worked with Dr. Fraser to study wildflower diversity at the college's Lillian Anderson Arboretum and document native bee plant interactions in nature preserves across Southwest Michigan. Nicki has enjoyed working on various environmental science projects at Kalamazoo College and plans to continue studying ecology in graduate school. Ann will be leading the discussion of bumblebees, blossoms, and boots on the ground, propelling pollinator conservation through citizen science. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Ruth. And I'll just pull up my slides here and we'll get started. So first, thank you very much, Ruth, for that introduction. And thank you to the Audubon Society and to Wild Ones for inviting us here this evening to talk about some of our work. But I'll dispense with the title since Ruth introduced you to this and just get straight into things. So, as she mentioned, I teach at Kalamazoo College, and I do have the very enviable job of getting to teach the bright minds of the future. And so one of the courses is my entomology course. And so in that course, I get to teach students about the wonderful world of insects, introduce them to that, also perhaps introduce them to a new career path, introduce them to a new hobby, or for some of them, they take the course, they say, because they wanted to get over their fear of bugs. And as far as I know, everybody that's taken it and had a fear of bugs got over it by taking this course. But one thing they do in that is that they do an insect collection to learn the different groups of insects. And as Ruth mentioned, that's how I got into studying pollinators and bees. Before that, I worked on more ecological studies of butterflies and ants. And here, there are many different types of bees that they were turning up in their collections. I had no idea existed in Michigan. And so I hope tonight that we'll give you a little glimpse into some of that. We're going to focus on bumblebees though. But that got me curious about the diversity, and I started sampling bees probably a little over 10 years ago. But more recently, I've turned my attention to bumblebees specifically because it can get overwhelming trying to look at all the different bees because you'll get a sense of how many. But my interest in the bees happened right at the time when colony collapse disorder was becoming prominent in the news. And so there was concern over pollinators. So it was kind of perfect. It was a perfect storm. So my interest in bees and the pollinator crisis was becoming evident. And so that led me in a new research direction, which is looking at our bees locally and looking at efforts to conserve them. Now, bees are one type of pollinator, and in this round graphic that I have, there's many types of pollinators, and these are just animals that move pollen between plants because they're visiting the plants, the flowers of the plants, to collect nectar and pollen. And so they help spread the pollen, which fertilizes the plants, and that produces the seeds and the fruits, which the plants need to produce the seeds for themselves for their own reproduction. But oftentimes there's fruit associated with that, or the seeds are edible. And so they're an important source to other animals as food, and that includes humans. So without plants or without pollinators, plant communities just wouldn't be sustained, and many animals wouldn't be sustained because of the food that they get from those plants. So incredibly important for the ecosystem services that they provide. And bees are the most effective, most common pollinators. And that's because of their habits of collecting pollen to feed to their young. Others visit for the purposes of drinking nectar or sometimes eating pollen. But the bees are actively getting it on their body so they can take it back to where they're raising their young to feed it to them. And if we look at the diversity of bees out there, we're all familiar with honeybees, but in North America, there's about 4,000 species, 4,000 different types of bees. And they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors. And these bright green ones you can find around here in Kalamazoo. And in Michigan alone, there was a 2019 study by a lab at Michigan State, and they cataloged 465 types of bees just in Michigan. And in my own diversity studies here in Southwest Michigan, we've turned up, upwards of at least 100 different types of bees. And that's from sampling only a few different sites in and around Kalamazoo in Southwest Michigan. So bees are very diverse, and they're very important pollinators. But like the honeybee, other bees are in trouble. So many of you have heard of the rusty patch bumblebee. This is Bombus aphanus. This was once common in Michigan, even here in Kalamazoo. I have a specimen in our collection from 1998, but once very common, and since the late 1990s, it's disappeared here in Michigan. And throughout the state, MNFI has been doing surveys. This bee has not been cited, once very common. It is still present in Illinois and in Wisconsin, but in low numbers. So it's one that's declined precipitously. And the yellow-banded bumblebee is another one that is newly listed for Michigan as a species of special concern, threatened. Its numbers are declining. It's still somewhat common in other areas, but it is declining. And what's true of these bumblebees is true of other bees. So it's not just those couple bumblebee species across North America. Here's some studies in Eastern North America. There's 21 different types of bumblebees. 50% of them are in decline, and some of them severely, like the rusty patched. In Michigan, we have 20 bumblebee species, and over 50% of them are declining. And just looking at all the other types of bees, what we would call wild bees. So these are the non-honey bees that don't live in managed hives. Um, a study looked at almost 120 different species from museum specimens and saw that over time, they're seeing, in terms of records, at least 12% of those types of bees are declining. And there's probably more, it's just they're less well studied. Honeybees are the most studied, bumblebees after that, and all these other types of bees we know very little about. But there are signs that they're declining. And this is not just bees that are declining, we're seeing global declines in insects generally. So up to 75% reduction in biomass over a 100-year period in some studies from Europe, and this is alarming. So causes of decline, why are bees and other insects and invertebrates declining? One of those reasons is pesticides. So pesticides in the environment, they're designed to kill things. Now, we don't target to kill pollinators, but they're collateral damage because they're present in areas that are being sprayed for other pests, or their immune system's just weakened by those pesticides, and then they can't fight off things like disease that is already present in the environment, or we have new diseases that are brought in. When we move honeybees around, they may be carrying diseases from one area to another, and they're foraging on the same flowers as other bees. So disease is another issue, and we have other species of bees that get introduced from time to time, and they can bring disease with them. Global climate change is another one, and that is, we're experiencing more intense temperatures sometimes in the summers, so some stronger heat waves. And bumblebees in particular, these are large-bodied bees that don't do well, and they're a cold climate species group, and so they don't do as well in those hot temperatures. Global climate change is also affecting our winters. So right now we have very little snow cover in the winter, and that's not good for overwintering insects because the insulation is not there. We might have more freeze-thaw periods. So these insects that are overwintering, they're less likely to make it through the winter. And then finally, we've got habitat loss and degradation. So here we're talking about conversion of land from natural area to agricultural areas, and with agricultural intensification, where we're only growing a single crop over a huge area, we've lost a lot of habitat for these pollinators. And that habitat contains the flowering plants that are their food source. Or habitat degradation, when we convert from natural areas to urbanization, development, we're losing habitat. And that's what we're going to focus on with our work, and that you'll hear about some tonight. So the work that we've been doing, a lot of it's been carried out at the Lillian Anderson Arboretum. So this is a property that's owned by Kalamazoo College. It's located in Oshtemo Township, just west of 131. And just past the Meijer and the Walmart. There's no sign on the road, so if you don't know about it, you can just type in Lillian Anderson Arboretum and you can find it, directions there, but there's no sign at the actual road for it. But on that property, there's a variety of habitats. It's about 160 acres altogether, and there's a power line that runs across the property. And that power line's about 2,000 feet long and about 60 feet wide. And this is ideal habitat to use to enhance it for pollinators. And so that's a project that we've been working on. I've been doing some bee sampling there, beginning in 2008. We did a floral survey in 2019 that Nicki will talk a little bit about. And we've started a habitat enhancement project that she's going to talk a little bit about. And so this is just a close-up of that arboretum and that power line. And here's the power line in the lower right. You can see it's not super wide, but it's nice and long. And we've got to keep it mowed anyway, or low vegetation, so great for pollinator habitat. And for this enhancement project, we moved forward on it when we got some money from the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, their Love Where You Live grants. So we got some money to start that as seed money. And then Russ Skipper and Ilse Gephardt, who are both members of Ask and the Wild Ones, they gave a generous matching gift to the college for the grant. And those two really helped us make this feasible. And then we also received funding from the Audubon Society of Kalamazoo. So thank you very much, Ask. And from the Nancy Small Memorial Fund. Tom and Nancy Small were co-founders of the Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones. And so thank you very much to Wild Ones and to Tom Small and Nancy Small for the funds they provided. And we've had a couple other small donations as well. So Nicki's going to update you on that work. Niko is going to talk about the bumblebee work that we've been doing and the citizen science efforts that we've gotten to try and get a handle on the bumblebees in this area. So tonight, they're going to talk about some of the research that they've done for their own thesis projects at the college. And just to introduce them, so Niko, here's second from the left, and Nicki, and then two other students who worked with us in 2019 as well on the Powerline project. So it's with the help of these many undergraduates that I work with at the college that has allowed me to really continue to do this type of pollinator work and branch out. Every year we're enlarging more and more what we can do. So I'll turn it over now to Niko and let him start off with an overview of the bumblebees and the work he's been doing.
Yeah, thank you, Ann. So I'm going to pull up my portion of the presentation. Okay, so a little background on bumblebees. As Ann mentioned, we know a lot about honeybees, and they certainly have received their share of the spotlight in terms of conservation. But native species like bumblebees are definitely declining precipitously, so it's important that we understand their populations too. So just a quick overview of the difference between honeybees and bumblebees. Honeybees inhabit far larger colonies than new bumblebees. Additionally, honeybees will, the entire colony will overwinter through that winter period, whereas bumblebees, only the new queens for the next year will overwinter into the new year. And finally, perhaps more obviously, honeybees produce honey, large amounts of it, which has led to their commercialization. Alternatively, although bumblebees produce honey, it's not nearly as much as their honeybee counterpart. So in the yearly cycle of the bumblebee, around early spring, I imagine in the next couple months, we'll see the queens that have overwintered emerging from their colonies and start looking for resources for their nests. And then that'll be followed by early summer and midsummer, the workers starting to arrive on scene, followed by the males in later summer and fall. Finally, towards the end of fall, you'll see like a quick mating period in which the new queens will overwinter, and the following year, the cycle will continue. So that's a little bit about bumblebees. Now we'll get into citizen science, which is a way of documenting these populations. And so in a larger focus of conservation, you have a three-step plan where first you're going to want to document the population of focus. You're then going to assess what resources are in the environment and what works for whatever population you're studying. And then you move forward with an action plan. And citizen science as a methodology fits into the documentation process. So when we are looking at citizen science compared to perhaps a traditional field survey, citizen science itself works on recruiting members from the community to aid in data collection through photography, in this case of bumblebees, but whatever subject is in focus. And so this kind of adheres to the theory of getting many eyes in many places, because if you see at the very simple graphic down below, traditional surveys will consist of a small team of expert researchers that will carry out their documentation themselves, whereas citizen science will still consist of that small group of researchers, but it will additionally branch out into the community so that those community members can take the photos and submit them in a way that provides a fuller and more robust picture of the population in the area. And so then this, by working with the community, generates more awareness of whatever cause you're seeking to address. And it just involves the community work, which is a good way to go about things. Why bumblebees might become the question next. For us, bumblebees obviously are pretty large, and additionally, they're fairly easy to work with in the sense that they fly comparatively kind of slower, and when they fly, they have an audible buzz that makes it easier for citizen scientists of all experience levels to document these organisms. And so seeking to create a citizen science program led us to develop the Southwest Michigan Bee Watch. And as a program, we have three primary goals. First and foremost, we're seeking to document the bumblebees in Southwest Michigan. But in addition to that, we're also taking a look at how a habitat and peripheral landscape plays a role into the biodiversity that we see within bumblebees. And additionally, we also want to work with the Southwest Michigan community towards bumblebee conservation and pollinator conservation at large. So to define Southwest Michigan, we really mean the 9 counties of Southwest Michigan listed in the pane on the left. As a research team, we have placed special emphasis on some of the public properties in the area, including the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy properties, the Lillian Anderson Arboretum, Pure Cedar Creek Institute, and the Kalamazoo Nature Center. But perhaps the most important point is that we welcome submissions from anywhere within these boundaries, which includes, a lot of our citizen scientists will submit data from their residential gardens. And so this private data, in a sense, really contributes to our citizen science cause and really speaks to the point that we really accept anything from within these 9 counties. So you got a little background on citizen science. Now we'll talk a little bit more about some of the requirements of being a citizen scientist and some tips and tricks for effectively going about the practice. So we require 3 things of our volunteers. First, you're going to have some kind of picture taking device, but importantly, it doesn't have to be a professional grade camera. If you have a smartphone, if you have a GoPro, or perhaps any other picture taking device, as long as it has picture taking capabilities, you're good to go. Additionally, you got to have access to internet in some form, only for the simple reason of having the ability to submit your photos up to the servers that we use to collect data. And probably the most important requirement is to have patience and a love of nature, because citizen science is a great opportunity to spend some time in our beautiful Southwest Michigan landscape, and loving that nature is going to help you with this process. So we recommend to our citizen scientists to kind of adhere to the 3+3 rule of thumb, which means, so in any citizen science submission, you are allowed up to 3 photos per submission, which is where the first 3 comes into play. And in the second 3, you're going to want to focus on 3 parts of the bee, 3 anatomical regions. So first the head, then the abdomen, then the side. And this is going to help with the identification process later down the road. But another really good rule of thumb that we use is photograph now, delete later. And what this means is that, let's say you're seeing a bee, it's visiting flower to flower, just continue to take a bunch of pictures, because it's always easier to go back in hindsight and delete the pictures that perhaps didn't have a clear focus of the bee, or maybe it was out of frame, than vice versa. So always take more photographs than you need, because it's easy to delete. So getting into some of the photo shots that I was talking about here in the red photo, in the photo, you can see in the red circle is a clear shot of the head, and what you'll be able to see is some of the coloration of that part of the body. Then this is the abdomen, or the backside of the bee, the side of the bumblebee, and then all of these are going to be important for the ID guides that are used to identify bumblebees to the species level. And so here are 3 of our 21 species here in Michigan. All 3 of those were seen in the previous pictures, right? And as you can see, some of the heads are colored differently. Some of the abdomens have different patterning. Some of the sides are even different colors. And so all these angles are important for helping us to identify what species you just took a photo of. So this is kind of an overview of the citizen science process as a whole and kind of what it looks like on the back end. So you take your 3, go up to 3 photos, you'll upload them to your computer, and 3 and 4 kind of go hand in hand. So either you'll use iNaturalist or Bumble Bee Watch, both are free platforms, but they will provide ID guides for you to identify your photo to the species level. You'll submit that photo, or photos, I should say. And at that point, experts on the site will verify your species estimation. And then 6, definitely keep going on to take photos, because what we find most valuable from citizen scientists is certainly when they're able to submit a photo to us, but those citizen scientists that can keep going throughout the season and continue to submit photos of bumblebees really helps us to develop a picture of bumblebee populations throughout the season. So probably our most salient point, we need every bit of help that we can get. And citizen science is a really effective way of monitoring bumblebee populations. Victoria McPhail and some of her colleagues found that citizen science is actually a really strong complement to traditional data, because citizen science is a very dynamic methodology and adapts well to fast-changing conditions of bumblebee populations. Additionally, citizen science allows us to develop an understanding more than just what's in public preserves, in the sense that when we get submissions from residential gardens, we're able to understand what kind of role those residential gardens on private land play in more developed areas where we don't get that as much with public preserves. And again, just to drive home the point, it's awesome when citizen scientists are able to continue submitting photos throughout the season, because again, that really helps us build a robust and fully developed picture of our bumblebee populations. So if you're interested in signing up, or if you just want to look at some of our resources, check out our website at swimbees.kzu.edu, and hopefully there's something there for you. So that is a little bit about our program. Now we'll talk a little bit about what we'll do with your data per se. So from the 2020 season, we were actually able to document the presence of 7 of our state's 21 bumblebee species. And this was really cool because the top 4 slots of the graph, those are all bumblebee species that are identified by MNFI as being stable for annual population change, whereas the bottom 3 actually have been identified as species of conservation concern. And so marking these 3 species in our Southwest Michigan region is really special, because we're going to be able to learn more about their habitat preferences and then start moving into our assessment portion of the conservation outline. So these actually, those conservation concern species here are actually the photos that we were able to take of them throughout the season. Just one representative photo of each species. Funny enough, all on wild bergamot. I got it on purpose, but anyway, yeah, here's a photo of all of them. So my undergraduate thesis focused specifically more on the role that factors such as surrounding landscape plays in the biodiversity that we see. And as Ann touched on, there's a number of components that fit into why we're seeing these declines. But one of the biggest reasons is habitat loss, and whether that's due to urbanization or to agricultural intensification, in either case, it's contributing to habitat loss. And so we looked at a ton of different public properties. And what was interesting is after we looked at all the data and looked at the biodiversity at each preserve, seeing 2 totally different preserves, one such as Bow in the Clouds, which is surrounded by heavily developed land, heavily built land, I should say. And on the other hand, Hidden Pond Preserve, which has almost no agricultural areas around it, and additionally no heavily built areas around it. Both of those boasted the full 7 species, the max that we saw. And so that was really interesting. And it led us to think more about the role that landscape plays, and perhaps maybe surrounding landscape isn't as important as having adequate floral availability throughout the whole season. And so this finding was especially interesting because it suggests that uh, individuals of our region can play a really important role within their residential gardens of offering strong floral resources for our bumblebee populations. And this is something we're interested in looking at over the next couple of years. So this really calls in a need for citizen scientists to continually monitor their residential gardens and hopefully find some of these species of conservation concern. So that's what I think we have a question break built in here. And now Ann is monitoring the chat for questions.
Right, and I did have a question, do we have a project on iNaturalist? Because iNaturalist can have special projects that you can contribute to.
Yeah, we have a project on both iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch. And so you would be able to find more about that on our website.
Mhm. And the iNaturalist project, you can join it, but we also have it set so that anybody that submits a bumblebee photo from Southwest Michigan, it automatically gets added to our project. We've got, capture all the bumblebees from these 9 counties. So even if you haven't officially joined it, we should be able to get your data. But Bumblebee Watch, you have to, again, you could just submit generally to it, or you can submit to our specific project. Now we've got some questions coming in. Yeah, here's an interesting one. When submitting photos, is it okay to get your ID incorrect? Is there someone on the other end that will correct it?
Oh my gosh, yes. It's definitely one of those things that's a steep learning curve because although bumblebees are a large bee, they're definitely small to the human eye, and so it's easy to mistake some of those patternings that are on the abdomen and other parts of the bee. And so 100%, there's always somebody on the other side that's an expert that knows the species identifications. But it's always fun to kind of take a shot at it and see if you're able to ID it correctly.
And another one about submissions would be if we have old photos, say from a couple years back, can we go back to our old photos and submit those from the past couple years?
Yeah, I mean, you would just have to be sure that in Bumblebee Watcher iNaturalist, you match those photos with the correct date. So, let's say you took the photo in 2017, August, you would want to make sure that that photo, when you submit it, is matched back to August of 2017.
Right, and then they also want locality information too, right?
Yep.
But it doesn't have to be exact. It can be, I think on the app you can pull up a map and kind of say, okay, put the pin on it. This is where I found it or something in this area. Okay, and then a couple other questions, and then we'll move on. One of them was, does deer predation on floral growth, so deer chomping on flowers, does that affect bumblebees? Hmm.
I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe we'd have to look into that in the next couple of years, but I don't know. That I'd have to think about that one.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, I know there's studies of milkweeds, that so when milkweed gets cut down and starts to regrow, that monarchs are more attracted to lay eggs on that. Are bumblebees more attracted to plants where they've been chewed on by the deer? Haven't seen any studies on that. And is the health of the bumblebees equivalent in the urban versus forested areas, or more woody areas, natural areas?
Well, my understanding is health's one of those things that's a little bit difficult to quantify. There's been a number of studies that to conflicting results actually on whether agricultural areas or heavily wooded areas versus heavily built areas, which ones had more of an impact on bumblebee population declines. But it seems like the evidence is still a little bit inconclusive.
All right, I think that's it right now for questions. There's one I'm just answering in the chat about submissions, but I think we'll move on to Nicki, and she's going to talk about plants and bees.
Yeah. All right. Let me share my screen for you. I have a lot of tabs open, so somehow it's more difficult than it should be. There it is. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so I'm going to tell you all a little bit more about flowers and plants in particular and how we can use the power of plants to save the bees. So Anne mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but just to give you all some basics on what bumblebees really need to survive, and that's twofold. So flowers are the primary food source for bumblebees, and they're looking for two things in flowers, both nectar and pollen. And nectar is really their main energy source, whereas pollen is something that they try to capture on their bodies to bring back to the colony, and that is what feeds the young. So obviously it's important to get both, and that nutrient dense pollen is key for raising the colony. So to find food, bumblebees go through a foraging process that at the very beginning stages, the queen will go out and forage for the colony. Then once it's established, female workers will go out and forage primarily either in the early morning or in the afternoon, but they're able to forage all day. It's just a factor of having the intense sun, so they wouldn't want to overheat in the midday. So more frequently foraging in the earlier, cooler times of day. And foraging really just looks like flying from flower to flower, and that's usually really quick and efficient because of their large body sizes. They're able to brave more challenging conditions than a lot of other smaller insects. So they are really resilient and amazing pollinators because of their ability to pick up such large quantities of pollen. And on the other side of having a large body, they also require a lot of food and a lot of nectar to be able to keep their energy up all day to forage. So their main thing that they require is just a lot of flowers. And as I'll really drill in throughout this presentation, the most important thing that we think for conservation is having a presence of food all season long, rather than just a bunch of plants at the beginning of the summer and a bunch at the end. So we want to make sure that bees are provisioned all season. And in terms of what they like to eat, bees or bumblebees particularly are not necessarily the pickiest, but they do have certain preferences that I will reveal in the next slides to come. But for the most part, they're pretty sturdy, and they can choose from a lot of different food sources that are available because, again, they just require a lot of food. So sometimes when there's slim pickings, they have to go for different things than they would want. But here I'll start to give you an overview on some of the different things that I looked at in my research to examine how these foraging preferences change between flowers and between bees. So some of the factors that I looked at were flower shape, the area, how many flowers were in one patch, maybe the smell of the flower, the species of the flower, and the origin. So whether it is native or non-native. And then I'm going to go over some reasons why maybe you should think twice about what you're pulling out of your garden, because it might be provisioning someone that you don't know about. And then lastly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found with our citizen science photos in terms of what flowers people were showing us in those photos and how important those resources are as well. And here you see a nice image of a bee on some Solomon's seal. So I'll start out by comparing flower shapes. So this was one of the most interesting things that I looked at in my research. And for example, I used Culver's root here and then Lanceolea coreopsis to show off the two different flower shapes that I delineated. So I identified Culver's root as an irregular flower shape And the only basis for this, it's sort of a loose definition, is really just that it's only symmetrical on really one plane of symmetry. It's got that long tube shape, and it's more of a closed, sort of just more funky looking flower, I guess, than what you would see here with this radially symmetrical lane sleeve coreopsis display. So your daisies, things that are open and have this circular shape, um, they actually attract different bees than do these irregular flower shapes. So what I found was that overall bees preferred irregular flower shapes to the regular flower shapes very significantly. And there's a number of reasons why we think this could be the case. One of them being the variation in tongue length that bumblebees have. So their bodies don't really differ much between species, but their tongues actually do differ in length. So bumblebees can have a longer tongue, and that long tongue is able to make it inside of these tube-like flowers to reach nectar that maybe other species wouldn't be able to reach. So it's a great source of nectar, and it's sort of a more specialized food source for bumblebees. And another factor is less so on the Culver's root, but on species like lupin or on indigo. Those are closed and a little bit more dense. So because bumblebees are large, they can pry inside of more closed flowers, and they can also rest on the lip of it. So having the access to that nectar and also the shape that's more conducive to a large body size, we think maybe those are some of the reasons why we saw so many bees preferring irregularly shaped flowers. So moving on to how we looked at some flower families, and of all the different flower species that we saw bees on this summer, we saw the most interactions with flowers in the mint family and in the legume family. And these weren't necessarily surprising, as you've seen a bunch of our pictures are on wild bergamot because it's a really highly attractive flower and it's planted all over Southwest Michigan. So we looked a little bit deeper to wonder why mint family might be better than daisy family per se. And one of the reasons is potentially that flowers in the mint family have more of a scent or an odor, which I'm sure you can imagine by it being the mint family. And another factor was within the lupin family, they have more of those like irregular shapes. They also have, um, sorry, uh, yeah, just within legumes, they're also really abundant because clovers are legumes. So as you could see, like just having a greater availability could also be a factor that causes us to see more bees interacting with these flower families. So another factor within the legumes that's interesting is that not only are they nutritional and available for the bees, but they potentially have more nutritious pollen than do other species of flowers. So that's all the more reason to plant them. And they also have nitrogen fixing properties in their roots. So they're also great for the soil health in your garden or wherever they're planted. So planting species in these families is potentially very favorable for bumblebees and for your garden. Lastly, I wanted to highlight what we saw in terms of the difference between bumblebee visits to native and non-native flower species. So here I've included the purple coneflower and the red clover. So obviously we're all very much pro planting native species, but I wanted to unpack a little bit about why it's so important to include native species in a wildlife preserve or in your garden. And it's mostly because native wildlife has co-evolved for millions of years with these native plants. So they are their most efficient pollinators. So you want to promote that efficient pollination and feed the bees what they're the most able and used to eating. So that's why we want to plant native species, and they grow best in the areas of concern. So planting species like the purple coneflower are a great option. And I also wanted to address that including non-native species, we saw a ton of bumblebees visiting red clover and other legumes that aren't necessarily native, but they're not aggressive either. So we wanted to make a distinction that even though non-native species are not preferable, we wouldn't want to encourage planting something that's a weed that you wouldn't want that is aggressive or invasive if the bees wanted it, but including non-native species like the red clover, which can provide the nitrogen fixing qualities for your soil health, we think is also beneficial. And if it's left on the side of your lawn, maybe leave it be if it's not hurting anything. So just to keep that in mind. Lastly, we wanted to highlight some of these gorgeous photos that we received from our citizen science submissions. And just to point out that we received a lot of different flower types that we didn't see in our surveys. So all the wild bergamots and a lot of the native species that we saw in the nature preserves, we didn't get to see in the private gardens, but we got to see a lot of like hydrangeas and sunflowers and all kinds of roses that we've learned are also really important areas for bumblebees to get resources, especially in urban areas. And as we talked about earlier, the habitat loss is one of the biggest factors contributing to bumblebee declines. So anywhere where we can include more flowers to help out the bees is a great spot in our book. So just know that even if you don't have these special sort of flower species that I've been highlighting, that is all good. Feel free to continue to keep the plants that you want in your garden, but also potentially introduce some new ones now that you have learned a little bit more about what the bees like to eat. All right, moving on, I wanted to share with you some more about other projects that we're doing at Kalamazoo College. And one of them is increasing education through informational signs that I've been working on for the last couple of years, and they're in place at the Lillian Anderson Arboretum and also on our website and on social media. And really, we wanted to just make this information more accessible to more people because we really think that increasing education is a key to conservation because you can't conserve something that you don't know anything about. So here I've included some examples of scientific illustrations that I made just to make more large-scale signs, which I'll show you in the next slide. But truly, this is just making science accessible and making this information interesting to more people. And here are some other signs that I made. The one to the left is our advertising sign for Southwest Michigan Bee Watch. And then the one to the right is more scientific information on native and wild bees. All right, now I'll tell you a little bit more about the pollinator habitat enhancement project that Ann mentioned earlier. So first of all, I wanted to address that this project is focused on all pollinators, not completely restricted to bees. So I want to identify who the pollinators are that are here because you might not know all the examples. And those are wild bees, syrphid flies, beetles, butterflies, moths, bats, and birds. Like Ann said, just getting pollen from one place to another, but all of these different creatures have different habitat and food needs. So we want to make this as accessible of a habitat as possible. And as she mentioned earlier as well, it's on the Lillian Anderson Arboretum Powerline Trail, and powerline right-of-ways are required to be kept mowed. So this is an excellent opportunity to use this space for something better than just to leave it open and mowed with just plain dirt or grass or anything. So we're excited to invite more pollinators there by planting native seed mixes and protecting this area and furthering development in the future with those native plants. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what plants we decided to put there in a moment. And lastly, what's exciting about this project is that we already did a survey in the past on the flowers that were in the Lillian Anderson Arboretum and on this trail specifically. So we have a great baseline for understanding how much it's improving as we're moving forward, which is really exciting for future research. So here you'll see just what the power line right-of-way would look like. And as you can see, there's plenty of open space for moving from flower to flower, and it's totally undisturbed. So this is a great opportunity for a pollinator habitat. Here is a little bit of information on what we saw before the plantings. So here's Amy and I looking at some wild indigo, and what we saw were 117 unique species of flowers in this area before we did any planting. Those were in 32 plant families, and 67% of them were native. And now we've moved on from those times, and we did mowing, and after the plant and bee surveys, obviously, we removed some invasive species because they were really aggressively overtaking the areas that we would like the native seeds to take root. So then in fall of 2020, the Kalamazoo Nature Center came in and planted native seed mixes that included both wet and dry habitats. So here are some more specific plants that we've highlighted. So obviously a lot of these I've already talked about in this presentation, just that they're excellent plants for bumblebees, and they're also great for other pollinators. And you'll also see that there are grasses and other forbs, because not just flowering plants are important when you're making a habitat. You want to be able to provision those nesting needs and also stabilize the soil with other grasses and plants. So now that you've heard all about the projects that we have going on, I'm sure you're wondering what you can do in your garden or your backyard to help. And here are some examples of small things that you can do, or small to large things, starting out with just spreading the word about pollinators. So take what you've learned in this presentation and spread it to your friends, because again, education is a great segue into conservation. And the more people who are aware of the problem, the better. And next, you want to understand who your local pollinators are. So don't forget about all those other native species of bees, not just bumblebees or honeybees. And we've got moths, butterflies, just as I had told you before. So be aware of all of those different organisms that need help. Next, we want to focus on planting native pollinator-friendly flowers. So here to the right, I included a list of different flowering plants and also when they're blooming. And as I said earlier, you want to make sure that you're provisioning bees with food all throughout the summer, because they do require so much food. So be sure to remember those species in particular. And then if you do nothing else, just ensure that there are plenty of flowers to go around all summer long. Next, you can provide nesting sites for bees, and those can either look like this man-made bee house to the right, which is just a collection of wooden dowels and stems, or you can just make sure that you have a open patch of ground, because a lot of solitary bees also nest underground. Finally, you can also offer water sources to wildlife, leaving little dishes of water. And please do remember to reduce or eliminate your pesticide use, because it does kill both useful insects and the insects that you might be wanting to get rid of. So just keep that in mind, and I hope that you enjoy these steps. And if you ever want this list of what to plant, then I can also send out this information afterwards. Lastly, we want to make sure that you guys have access to staying connected to us through the rest of our projects. So if you're interested in becoming a citizen scientist, then please join Southwest Michigan Bee Watch. I think that the link is already in the chat, so we'd love to have more participants there. And also follow along with the Pollinator Habitat Enhancement Project at arboretum.kzoo.edu, and we'll be posting more images there as we get progress and hopefully some beautiful blooms in the spring. And thank you to all of these partners who helped us get information and helped us learn everything that we have about bees and bumblebees specifically.
Thank you, Nicki. And so she's just put up a couple of resources here that are great resources for finding out more about plants, creating pollinator habitat, learning more about bees. So Pollinator Partnership is an organization. They've got some great resources. Xerces Society has a pollinator resource center that's got all kinds of information. And Heather Holm, who's been in Kalamazoo to speak on pollinators before, she's got 2 wonderful books on bees and the plants that support them. So look at her website and get some information. Thank you, Nicki and Niko, for giving us that overview. And we've had a few questions come in here. Can I get permission to reprint the support poster that you made, Nicki?
For sure. Yeah. I can send it to whoever can get that information to you.
I can send that to Jennifer. A couple of people are chiming in with some bee magnet plants that they have. Catmint was mentioned, and blunt mountain mint. Yeah, I don't know, blunt mountain mint. Monarda punctata. So that's another mint family. What's the common name for Monarda punctata? Somebody help me out. Spotted bee balm. Okay. Yeah, Veronica was one that in Nova Scotia that was last summer. I had bumblebees all over that one. Other questions for Nikki, if people want to, or more for Niko.
There was a question about tricks to finding and observing emerging queens in the spring.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if I can say I have any tricks. I think the thing that's difficult is it's easiest to see bumblebees when they're visiting flowers because they spend a lot of time at the flower, whereas queens in the spring will tend to be flying all about, looking more so for resources for their nest as opposed to actually visiting flowers. So in that way, you might be able to see them, flying through the air per se, more so than um, I don't know, seeing them come out of their nest.
And that's a good question, because one thing, what you will see in the spring, the queens, I mean, they're really big. So, you see a big bumblebee, it's a new queen that's survived the winter. They're going to be a lot of times flying low to the ground, like they're just barely above the soil surface. And you think, well, what the heck are they doing? They're not looking for flowers necessarily to feed on. They're looking for a nest hole. So a lot of them will nest in old rodent burrows. And I did see a study at the entomological conference this fall where a lab in British Columbia actually added a mouse urine to some of their bumblebee boxes. So you can make artificial nest boxes and put cotton in there. And we've tried that. We never got them colonized, but they put mouse urine in these and they had 3 times as many occupancies with the mouse urine. So, those rodent burrows, there's probably something that's helping the bumblebees to find those. What would be nice as citizen scientists is, and if you go to the Bumblebee Watch site, they have a queen bee watch thing. So what we're really interested in, and this is conservationists in general, with the bumblebees are with these species that are imperiled, we don't know a lot about their nesting habits. And so if you can spot where a bumblebee is going into a hole in the ground and seems to be building their nest, what we really like to see are pictures of that nest entrance and the habitat around it to build up a picture of what makes for good nest site selection. What characteristics are there. And in the spring, a lot of the forage for the bees, early spring, you've got your spring ephemerals, but some of the early trees like redbud, magnolia, and so on, those are great resources for bees in general in the early spring. Okay, we have more coming in here. Do you see, Pam, do you have a question there to shout out? Or?
So let's see. Can you catch in a butterfly net, bees in a butterfly net, put into a jar to get better photos? Is that allowed?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, Nikki, go ahead.
I was just going to interject and say that the one thing to look out for is if you do see a very large queen, especially early in the spring, we usually try to avoid trapping those just because you don't want to do anything to harm the process of trying to increase the number of bees, especially at the beginning of the season. But later on in the year, I think it is pretty harmless to catch a worker and then release it.
And I will, I'll net queens and a jar, a glass jar. I find works well to get it. And some people suggest, like, with photos, if you just take a video of the bee that's flying around, you'll get the different angles, and because then you can just take screenshots from that video to actually get the angles that you want.
Mm-hmm. Another question about what type of bees live in the holes that bore in people's homes.
Yeah, those are carpenter bees. So they look like bumblebees. They're about the same size, but they have a shiny abdomen, a shiny butt, and those are carpenter bees. And yeah, they actively excavate the wood to nest in. You can try plugging up the holes, but they're just going to drill somewhere else. Some people say a solution would be to put a cedar post out somewhere else in your yard, that they do like cedar. So put a cedar post somewhere. There was a question about where do you get seed for larger pollinator projects? And yeah, so we got ours from Native Connection. So that's Jared Foster who runs that, and that was a big project. And so Native Connections is a good source for seed. Let's see, and if you go to the Wild Ones webpage on our resources, you'll see a list of sources for native seed, various companies.
We have a lot of great suggestions of plants and trees that bees enjoy. Any other questions? I think we've caught everything in the chat so far, Anne.
Yeah.
Here's one. Are carpenter bees good pollinators?
I guess I'll answer that one too, since I know those carpenter bees. Yes, they are. I mean, for certain plants, the passion vine, I had a passion vine, and they just fit perfectly in there for pollinating those. But yes, they are good pollinators because they're feeding their young nectar and pollen.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody said, yeah, I moved a paver and a bee was underneath. Do they usually burrow under pavers? I gently put the stone back and now don't move it until it's 50-degree weather. Yeah. So, the vast majority of bees nest in the ground. And so I have bees that nest between my paving stones, like the little bit of dirt that's between them. And I've had leafcutter bees there. I have mining bees there. And so, yeah, they're looking for some bare ground, basically. And so they might go, in the little space beside the paver and then nest underneath of that. Those nests are not going to be big nests of bees. It's just going to be like a tube that might have about eight cells in it, 8 bees that will come out, and that's it. And they're not going to be active all year round. That nest would probably be open only for 2 weeks maybe while it's being provisioned, and then it gets covered over and the new bees won't come out till next year. So I just leave them and I go about my business on my patio and we coexist very nicely. How do you prevent the power company from destroying everything? Do you want to take a stab, Nicki?
I was assuming it was for the pollinator habitat enhancement project, so I'm not sure what your deal is with consumers there.
Yeah. So we did strike a deal with consumers. We said, it's their right of way, but we said we would like to convert this to wildflower planting, and we will maintain it. So the only time they have to come in is if there are trees down that are threatening the line and it's a safety issue, then they'll come in or for some routine maintenance. But they just replaced the power poles, so they shouldn't have to bring their big equipment in for a while. So we basically said we'll take over the maintenance. And Wild Ones is going to have a presentation in May from somebody who works with the power companies to get pollinator habitat on utility right of way. So you might be interested in that May presentation. And the maintenance that we do, mowing is right now mowing, and we've had to do some selective herbiciding for certain things that were taking over the power line before we planted. So there was a lot of rubus, blackberry, raspberry that was really taking over, and buckthorn that was taking over, and sassafras that we have to spot treat because it is forested on both sides. We get the sassafras coming in and so on. Yes, Nicki, a couple of people asking for a copy of your poster. So yeah.
And that would be so popular.
We'll just got to finalize that, and the big sign will go up in the Arboretum this summer probably.
Yep, that's the plan. Then we'll have another sign on the way that'll be centered on other pollinators besides bees too. So if you get a chance to go to the Arboretum, hopefully you'll get to see some of those.
and native, what are native plants, yeah. And Pollinator Week is in June, I believe. Yeah, towards the end of June. So look out for that. We'll probably have an event at the Arboretum for that.
Great. Well, I think you answered all the questions. I don't know if Nate or Jesse have any last words. I am going to put a slide up that shows the next programs, both for Wild Ones and the Audubon Society. So I'll put that up now. And if anybody else wants to comment further, please go ahead while I'm doing that.
Somebody was asking about access to the Arboretum. Is there an entrance on West Main? Yes, there is. Yes, it's just past the Francini's Pizza sign, or whatever it is, just before you get to Bonnycastle Lake. And if you go to the Arboretum website, you will find directions to it.
Great. Well, I will just say thank you for everyone for joining us this evening. It was such a fascinating presentation. Thank you to the three of you. It was wonderful. I think we all enjoyed really having this co-program. It was a great opportunity for us to be together and share some of these interesting topics. So we did record this session. We will have it available for both organizations. You can find it, I know, we'll be able to find on the websites, and we'll make sure Nikki's poster gets out there to everybody.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.